Have you ever noticed how some people, like, they just seem to kind of sail through life's challenges, right? But then there are others who just get kind of stuck. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like stuck in
Yeah.
these repeating patterns.
It's a really interesting phenomenon, and it's something we're going to unpack today as we dive deep into the link between trauma and addiction.
We've got these really interesting Scientific American articles.
Fascinating stuff.
And trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this because what we're going to talk about today is, well, it's eye-opening.
It really is. It's a connection that often flies under the radar, but when you really understand it, it can completely change the game, both in how we approach treatment and how we even view these issues as a society.
Yeah, and it's something I'd never really thought about until I remember I was visiting a friend in rehab. And just anecdotally, I was really struck by, like, how many of the people there had these really, really difficult backgrounds, you know?
Yeah.
And it turns out that is not a coincidence. These articles highlight this really, really jarring statistic. 85%, a staggering 85% of individuals who are battling addiction have experienced at least one major adverse childhood experience.
It really underscores the incredible impact that even our earliest experiences can have on the way our brains develop. And,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that when we talk about trauma, we're not just talking about the big T traumas, those huge life-altering events.
Right.
It's the seemingly smaller things, too, those everyday stressors that can accumulate over time and leave a lasting impact, especially during those early years when the brain is literally being wired.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit because you're talking about neuroscience here, which I find endlessly fascinating. So how does childhood trauma, even like you said, the smaller stuff, actually change the way our brains work, the way
Yeah.
they function?
Okay, so imagine a child growing up in a household where a parent has anger issues. Their brain is constantly on high alert.
Makes sense.
And over time, it actually becomes hardwired to perceive threat, even in neutral situations. Like the article gives us a really powerful example. That child might grow up to misinterpret a neutral facial expression as anger, simply because their brain has learned to associate those subtle cues with danger.
Wow, so it's almost like their internal alarm system is constantly going off, even when there's no actual danger present.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really, really interesting. The same areas in the brain that are activated when we're seeking pleasure are also activated when we're seeking safety. And both of these drives are heavily influenced by dopamine.
Wait a second. Dopamine? I thought that was the feel-good chemical, like the reward chemical. I didn't realize it had anything to do with trauma.
Yeah, it does. And you're right, it is about rewards, but it's not as simple as just pleasure. It's really about motivation,
Yeah.
driving us toward what feels good and away from what feels bad, right?
Okay.
In a traumatic situation, your brain releases dopamine, and it's basically urging you to find relief from that distress.
Uh-huh.
Any relief.
Okay, I see. So trauma basically kind of like hijacks this reward system, making someone more susceptible to seeking that relief, potentially in unhealthy ways, like through substances. It's like a shortcut in a way.
Precisely. And then on top of that, we've got the brain's opioid system, which is also heavily involved in both pleasure and safety.
Right.
And, one of the articles brought up this incredible point about nurturing touch in infancy. It's absolutely crucial for developing the ability to regulate stress.
Really? I never knew there was like a biological link between like touch and stress regulation.
There is. When an infant receives nurturing touch, it actually triggers the release of opioids and oxytocin, creating this deep sense of comfort and safety in the brain. And those early experiences are what build resilience later on. But when those experiences are missing, well, that's when the stress response system can become dysregulated, making it so much harder to cope with stress later in life.
Which again circles back to what you were saying earlier about that constant state of high alert, making someone more vulnerable to seeking that quick fix through drugs or alcohol or whatever it might be.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding this neuroscience is so crucial, because it exposes the flaws in these old school tough love approaches to addiction.
Right.
Especially for individuals who have these trauma histories.
Because you're basically punishing someone who is already struggling with the physiological effects of trauma.
Exactly. And doing more harm than good. What they need is compassion and understanding.
Support, not blame.
Yes, exactly. Shaming someone who's already carrying the weight of trauma only re-traumatizes them, making that journey to recovery so much more difficult. What they really need is compassionate, trauma-informed care. And that's where these promising new therapies come in, like COPE concurrent treatment of PTSD and substance use disorders
Yeah.
using prolonged exposure.
Cope. Okay. We're going to get into that right after this break. So cope, this whole idea of like intentionally revisiting traumatic memories, I got to be honest, it seems kind of, I don't know, counterintuitive. Like, wouldn't that make things worse, not better?
Yeah, it's a common reaction for sure.
Yeah.
But actually, it's quite the opposite. Remember how we were talking earlier about how avoidance is like a hallmark of trauma? COPE actually provides this framework for people to, in a very, very safe and controlled environment, actually confront those avoided memories, those avoided emotions. And in doing so, they start to kind of chip away at the power that those memories hold.
Okay. So instead of just letting these memories kind of live in the shadows and control them, they're basically like shining a light on them, facing them head on.
Yes, exactly. But it's really important to emphasize that this is not about just throwing someone into the deep end.
Right.
This is done very, very carefully with a trained therapist at a pace that feels manageable for the individual. And one of the articles highlights this really incredible case study of a veteran named Michael who had tremendous success with COPE.
Oh, wow. So what was Michael's story?
So Michael had experienced a lot of trauma in his life, difficult upbringing, witnessed some horrific things in combat. He was struggling with both PTSD and a substance use disorder. But through COPE, he was able to revisit those really, really painful memories in a safe space, process them, and ultimately kind of retrain his brain to recognize safety.
Wow. So instead of constantly feeling triggered, he was able to develop like a new relationship with those memories.
Yes, exactly. And by confronting those buried experiences, he was able to break free from that cycle of avoidance and craving and actually learn healthier coping skills to manage his stress, which in turn significantly reduced his urge to turn to substances. It really highlights how powerful this idea of rewiring the brain's response to those triggers can be.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder how many people out there are struggling because they haven't had the opportunity to actually address the root cause, that underlying trauma.
It's a critical question, and especially when you consider just how widespread trauma really is.
Yeah.
But the good news is that COPE isn't the only tool in the toolbox. There's another very promising therapy called cognitive processing therapy, or CPT.
Okay, so let's talk about CPT a little bit. How's that different from COPE?
So while COPE really focuses on directly confronting and processing those traumatic memories, CPT takes a slightly different approach. It's more about identifying and challenging the negative thoughts and beliefs that often stem from those traumatic experiences.
Okay.
It can be a bit gentler in the sense that it's less about reliving the trauma itself and more about reshaping how someone views themselves and the world, because of that trauma.
So for someone who might find the idea of like directly revisiting those memories too overwhelming, CPT could be a better fit.
Exactly. And the article actually gives a really powerful example of this with a woman named Sandra.
Okay. Tell me about Sandra.
So Sandra had struggled with addiction for a number of years. And then in her early 20s, she was held hostage and sexually assaulted by her boyfriend.
Oh my gosh, that's awful.
Yeah. And understandably, this event just, intensified her existing substance use disorder.
Right.
But through CPT, she was able to pinpoint and challenge those negative core beliefs that had really taken root as a result of her trauma. Things like, I'm not good enough, I'll never find happiness, or that deep-seated feeling of, I'll never be safe again. These beliefs had become so ingrained that they were actually fueling her addiction.
Wow. So it's almost like the trauma created this like distorted lens through which she viewed herself and the world.
Exactly. And by working with her therapist to really examine those beliefs, challenge their validity, and replace them with healthier, more empowering ones, she was able to break free from that cycle of negative thinking and move toward recovery.
That's incredible. So both COPE and CPT are showing real promise, but it sounds like the key is really finding that approach that best suits the individual's needs and their comfort level.
100%. There is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to trauma and addiction. And this is where the importance of that compassionate, trauma-informed care really can't be overstated.
It really makes you think about like how we approach not just addiction, but, mental health in general.
Absolutely.
Like moving away from that kind of, I don't know, outdated tough love mentality and really embracing like a more empathetic, a more understanding approach. Because, like you said earlier, shaming someone who's already dealing with the weight of trauma, like you're adding insult to injury, right?
It really is. It's like instead of setting a broken bone, you're just, hitting it with a hammer.
Right.
Trauma-informed care on the other hand, it's all about creating that safe space, where there's trust, collaboration. It recognizes that a lot of the behaviors that we often associate with addiction are actually just their coping mechanisms.
Right.
They're ways of dealing with the pain of that unhealed trauma.
So it's not about judging the behavior. It's about understanding the why behind it.
Exactly.
Helping someone understand their own story and then giving them the tools to kind of like rewrite the narrative, so to speak.
Yeah.
It seems like such a common sense approach, but it's amazing to me how often, traditional models of treatment kind of just miss the mark there.
It's a huge shift in perspective. And it goes beyond just the therapy itself.
Right.
It's about creating an environment, a culture, where these individuals feel seen and heard, and they feel empowered to heal at their own pace.
And that actually brings up a point that I've been thinking about a lot lately. We're talking about trauma and addiction. But if this trauma-informed approach can be so effective in this context, do you think it could be beneficial in a broader sense, like in mental health as a whole?
It's such an important question, and especially when you consider, like we've been talking about, how prevalent trauma really is.
Right, exactly. This isn't some niche issue. So, are we even scratching the surface when it comes to addressing mental health if we're not addressing trauma on a societal level?
It's like trying to solve for X without all the information, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We need to acknowledge just how widespread trauma is, and not just the individual impact, but the ripple effects it has on families, communities, systems.
So where do we even begin? What would you say to our listener? What's the one thing you hope they take away from this whole deep dive?
That's a good question. I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that understanding the connection between trauma and addiction, it's not about dwelling in the problem. It's about recognizing that there's so much potential for healing.
Right.
There's potential for growth.
It's about empowerment.
Yeah.
Empowering ourselves and each other to break free from these cycles and create a more compassionate, more informed world.
Absolutely. And that starts with awareness. It starts with having these conversations, approaching these issues with curiosity, with a willingness to learn.
So to our listener, we leave you with this. How can you bring a more trauma-informed lens to your own life, to your relationships, to your work? It's a question worth sitting with. It's something to think about as you continue to, kind of explore the world around you.